Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today I want to walk you through a story that has been getting a lot of attention lately. Not because it's dramatic in the usual political sense, but because it exposes some big structural issues inside the U.S. immigration court system. And it also touches on a major fraud case involving a Somali-American community network that managed to take advantage of weaknesses in that same system. My goal today isn't to take a side. It's simply to explain what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about how immigration courts work, or, in some cases, how they don't work. So let's break it down step by step. Over the past few months, federal investigators have revealed a large-scale fraud scheme involving dozens and potentially hundreds of Somali immigrants and asylum applicants. The allegations are pretty serious. People were allegedly coached to fabricate stories about persecution, threats, or clan-based violence back in Somalia. In many cases, the people involved were not fleeing danger at all. Some had left Somalia years earlier and were already living safely in Kenya, Ethiopia, or the Middle East before applying for asylum in the U.S. Others had been living in the U.S. for a long time but were encouraged to claim new threats that supposedly emerged recently, even though there was no evidence these threats were real. According to investigators, a network of translators, community organizers, and even a few local leaders acted as fixers, essentially middlemen who helped prepare fabricated stories. They allegedly told asylum seekers exactly what to say, what details to include, which clans to mention, and how to answer specific questions immigration judges were likely to ask. Now, to be clear, most Somali immigrants have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. But in this specific case, the fraud was widespread enough that the Department of Homeland Security opened a full investigation into over 1,000 asylum files linked to this network. So the question becomes, how did this manage to slip through the system for so long? This leads us to the second part of the story. To understand how a fraud network could survive for years, you first need to understand the structure of the immigration court system. And if you've never looked deep into how these courts actually function, the reality might surprise you. Immigration courts in the U.S. are not part of the federal judicial branch. They are part of the Department of Justice under the Executive Office for Immigration Review, or EOIR. Judges are not lifetime appointed. They're hired by the Department of Justice, and they can be reassigned or replaced much more easily than standard federal judges. And here's where the issue begins. For many years, immigration courts were overloaded, understaffed, and built on outdated procedures. Caseloads skyrocketed. Judges were expected to handle hundreds or even thousands of cases a year. Many didn't have proper translation support. Others didn't have digital tools or modern evidence verification systems. Everything from identity checks to document authentication often relied on outdated methods. In that kind of environment, organized fraud becomes much harder to detect. Add to that the fact that many asylum cases contain stories that are difficult or nearly impossible to verify through independent sources, especially when they concern conflict zones, clan disputes, or tribal histories in places where journalists and foreign officials aren't able to travel freely. So it's not that judges were careless. In many cases, the system simply didn't give them what they needed to thoroughly evaluate every single application. Now we move to the political part of the story, but don't worry, I'm going to explain this in a neutral, factual way. When the Trump administration came into office, one of its major immigration goals was to restructure EOIR and the asylum system. Not necessarily because of the Somali case specifically, but because the administration believed the entire system was vulnerable to large-scale fraud. So the Trump administration rolled out a series of changes. 1. Hiring more immigration judges. They dramatically increased the number of immigration judges in order to reduce the massive backlog of cases. Before that, delays could stretch for years, giving fraud networks room to operate. 2. Setting performance expectations. The administration introduced certain performance metrics for judges, essentially expectations for how many cases a judge should handle within a certain time frame. Supporters said this would help clear backlog. Critics said it risked rushing cases. 3. Directing courts to be more skeptical of certain claims. The Department of Justice issued new guidelines encouraging judges to scrutinize asylum stories more carefully, especially in regions known for inconsistent documentation or clan-related narratives, Somalia being one of those areas. 4. Strengthening the role of immigration prosecutors. Government attorneys were encouraged to more aggressively challenge cases that appeared suspicious or lacked documentation. Now, whether you agree or disagree with these reforms is a separate topic. Some people argue the system needed stricter oversight. Others argue the reforms were too heavy-handed and could discourage legitimate asylum seekers. But one thing is clear: these reforms were aimed at the exact vulnerabilities that allowed fraud networks like the Somali case to operate. When you put all of this together, the fraud network, the overloaded immigration courts, and the structural reforms, a bigger picture starts to emerge. 1. The system was easy to exploit. Because many asylum stories rely on personal testimony, and because documentation from places like Somalia is often unreliable or unavailable, fraud networks knew they could operate with relatively low risk of detection. Judges didn't always have the tools they needed. Without strong verification mechanisms, even well-meaning judges struggled to determine who was telling the truth. The backlog created pressure. When courts are overwhelmed, questionable cases can slip through because there simply isn't time to scrutinize everything thoroughly. Political polarization didn't help. Whenever immigration becomes a political fight, it becomes harder to implement reforms smoothly or build bipartisan systems that actually work long-term. There are 3 main reasons this story continues to matter today. Reason 1. Immigration fraud affects legitimate asylum seekers. Every fabricated story makes it harder for people who are genuinely fleeing danger to be believed. Cases like this hurt the credibility of the entire system. Reason 2. It exposes the challenges of immigration reform. People often talk about fixing the system, but cases like this show how complicated that really is. It's not just about border security. It's also about court staffing, technology, data verification, and international cooperation. Reason 3. It raises real questions about how we balance compassion and enforcement. Most Americans want a fair system that lets in people who genuinely need protection. At the same time, they want a system strong enough to prevent abuse. Stories like this force policymakers to think about where that balance should be. The Somali fraud investigation is still ongoing. More files are being reviewed, and more individuals may face charges. But beyond the investigation, this case may push the U.S. government, regardless of which party is in power, to look again at immigration courts and asylum procedures. Will we see new technologies for identity verification? Will asylum interviews become more standardized? Will the government invest more in judges and interpreters? Or will reforms slow down again due to political disagreements? Right now, those questions are still wide open. So that's the overall picture. A major fraud network inside the Somali community exposed weaknesses in the immigration court system. The Trump administration tried to fix those weaknesses through structural reforms, and the entire situation highlights how complicated immigration policy really is in the United States. None of this is about blaming any group or promoting any political message. It's about understanding how the system works and why sometimes it doesn't. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives like this, especially ones that break down complex issues in a clear and neutral way, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know what topic you'd like me to cover next.